So we're real excited to have Ruth and Niamh here. So Ruth and Niamh are artists, and they are who were our first artists in residence as part of an exchange program we set up with Virginia Tech, where we went out to Virginia Tech and to DC and to New York also for last September, October. And then we had an artist come in here, Chelsea, Tomta, who came here for 2 weeks as well. So we're hoping that'll be the start of a long and fruitful relationship. And it was made even more likely by how well it seemed to go and how wonderfully impressed Virginia Tech were with Niamh. So rather than just reading out what this says here, I'll just say they were great, and it's great to have them. And so they were engaged a bit with some of the archive of letters, immigrant letters that's based here in the university, of Irish immigrants writing back. There's a really nice digitized archive of letters, which I think he found really rich as well. And so, we are delighted to have them here to talk a little bit about their work today.
Hi. Thanks for coming. We're going to talk a little bit about research as well as our recent projects. As collaborative artists, we make videos, texts, and performances. We're going to read just because I can kind of go all over the place if I start talking.
And I don't remember anything.
Yeah.
So it's a great combination.
Yeah. But if you have any questions or interjections, just put your hands up because it's a small group, so we can be quite informal with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We'll talk about some of the ideas behind the work first, and then we might just talk a bit about our actual process. We'll just be very linear about how an artwork that we make gets made.
So a lot of artists have been working together for 13 years. We're based between Sligo and Leitrim. My name's Niamh.
I'm Ruth.
And for this talk, we're going to tell the story of the work we've been making over the past number of years, and also share some research methodologies that we use in our artistic practice. Our work is quite research heavy. We want to say thank you to the University of Galway Centre for Creative Technologies, to Con and David for inviting us to speak today, and just echo that we were really privileged to get to go on the residency to Virginia Tech and Washington DC last year.
And now we showed this slide to some students in the Virginia Tech, and they didn't have a clue what we were talking about. They'd never seen Titanic, so it just made no sense. But hopefully you've all seen Titanic. Our current work examines official pop cultural and folk narratives of progress and nostalgia, complacency and solidarity, and romance and pragmatism as part of an ongoing search for moments of potential in history. And a dialogue between these ideas is enacted through our collaborative process, often taking the form of very conversational storytelling, videos and text. So before leaving for our trip to America last year, as Con said, we went and spent some time reading letters from this was online, from the Immerka Kirby Miller collection, and Irish emigrant letters and memoirs from North America, which is a vast collection of historic letters held here in the University of Galway Library. So the following is an excerpt from a letter by Patrick Kelly in Davenport, Iowa, to Vere Foster Esquire in Ireland from the 12th of January, 1858. No matter what folks may say of America, I love it as my adopted country. I love it for its noble and liberal institutions. In fact, I look on its constitution and the basis in which it is founded as being nothing short of an almighty and providential scheme. Just let the stars and stripes be unfurled here, even on these western prairies. Blow a trumpet and chant a tune of Yankee Doodle or Hail Columbia, and see how many will be in a few moments under arms, rallying beneath the banner of liberty, not unlike John Bull that must show his horns to drive them to it, or use some scheme to cheat them to it, or pass an act to force them to it.
So storytelling, oral, written and visual, has throughout history provided a means to create common identity, and it's in that context that we're asking the following questions with our work. So questions are, What historical experiences or agendas have contributed to the construction of Ireland's identity thus far? How does this identity inform our approach to contemporary global issues? And how can we, or why should we, challenge and amend those narratives? So given our shared history with America and total immersion in Western mass media, it's really difficult to separate Ireland's contemporary self-perception from the influence of the United States. We perceive a longing felt throughout Irish history to go west, from the legendary voyage of St. Brendan through years of migration. Last summer, we visited another collection of letters, also held here at the University of Galway Library. Those letters are from a society known as the Guillermo Herries League, which was set up in 1936 in an attempt to have a newly constructed bridge over the Chicago River named after an early Irish explorer. So the League says, "Gentlemen, in connection with finding a proper name for the Great New Bridge now under construction at the mouth of the Chicago River, we are endeavouring to locate data on the famous Irishman whose name appears at the top of this letterhead," so Guillermo Herries. "He is reputed to have made voyages to the American continent previous to Christopher Columbus, and upon the occasion of a visit to the city of Galway by Columbus, to have informed him of his travels, and to have accompanied Columbus as a pilot on his first voyage to the island of Hispaniola, or Haiti, where he was left to found the first Spanish settlement in the New World." So an Irish person discovered America, is their argument.
So Jason Reed writes, "The scenarios that we imagine, the stories and narratives that we consume inform our understanding of reality, not in the sense that we confuse fiction with reality, but that the basic relations that underlie our fictions shape our understanding of reality." And indeed, Ireland's construction of global Irishness, for example, the figure of the plucky, roguish underdog, is appropriated from Irish American culture rather than the other way around. In promoting this kind of essential Gaelic character, we run the risk of propagating dangerously ethnonationalist and exclusionary narratives that nostalgically long for simpler times, that is, a more homogenous and patriarchal society. The research informing this body of work investigates the way in which Irish and American ideas of the rural West occupy the popular imagination, and how this construction can be used to interrogate the intersecting subjects of colonialism, tourism, art history, capitalist expansion, environmental destruction, and protest.
Sorry for the cursed AI-generated Irish postcards.
Can I ask a question about
Yeah.
the previous image? It's very interesting. You just put the simply Ireland holiday prompt into that, and it's come out.
We didn't do the prompt, they were just, we found them online.
Oh, we just
Yes.
found them.
So there was an article from about this DALL-E AI image generator, which at the time in 2023 wasn't available in Ireland, about whether or not it could create the previous image, which is the classic John Hind postcard. So these would have been around in the mid-century, like right up until recently. I think you can probably still get a lot of them in Galway, as this sort of archetypal image of like beautiful Ireland with the red-haired children and donkeys and sheep. And so a prompt was, I guess, all of his images were put into that AI algorithm, and then it came out with these. And this one, 2026, it was given a slightly different prompt, which was like a futuristic version, or like a contemporary version of Ireland.
Guy is the spit of my neighbour.
It's able to make Irish people. Yeah. So it's kind of this, I guess we put them in there as a sort of extension of that, like those kind of homogenous images of the west of Ireland. We'll go on. Thank you. No, of course. Really, feel free to ask any questions. It's so interesting. So one aspect of this thinking about how early 20th century representations of Ireland have come to shape our national and diasporic consciousness, one aspect of this thinking is about that, Images of rural Irish landscapes in painting, photography and cinema have contributed to a constructed sense of national identity, which in turn has influenced the state's relationship with emigrant and immigrant populations, our environment and our built heritage. Powerful stories non-verbally, images such as this one by Paul Henry have long been used as propaganda for the building and expansion of nation states. Landscape painting was a key component of 18th and 19th century British imperial ideology. During that time, unsettled nature and nations would be enclosed not only by the administration of the empires, but also inside the confines of a beautiful picture. These often innocuous images were used to whitewash colonial projects and to advertise foreign settlements to prospective emigrants, as well as to promote tourist campaigns.
In the US, these aesthetics, as seen in the Western genre, broadly acknowledge the struggle for the hard-won freedoms of the so-called New World, but rarely depict the associated terror inflicted on Indigenous communities. Irish immigrants contributed not only to the mass destruction of Indigenous people, their way of life, and millions of bison from the 16th century onwards, but the ongoing oppression and institutionalization affecting subsequent generations into the present day. In the early days of the Irish state, paintings by artists like Paul Henry, Charles Lamb, and Maurice McGonigal depicted a pre-modern vision of an unspoiled land. However, these paintings paradoxically had a modernizing effect insofar as they helped to create a new, homogeneous national self-conception which combined rural folkways of living with a strict Catholic moral ideology. This pastoral tendency in Irish painting can also be considered alongside the trend of so-called primitivism in Western art, for example, the work of Paul Gauguin, which supposedly celebrated the quote-unquote natural expressive creativity of untrained and quote naive cultures.
That desire to create an authentic Irish style is rooted in an imagined version of pre or early Christian society here, chiming with this sensibility, romanticising the past while making a political nationalist statement. Key to this aesthetic was the elevation of the rural over the urban as a more essentially Irish way of life. This is clear both from state propaganda, for example, Eamon de Valera's famous "The Ireland That We Dreamed Of" speech, and the infantilization of the Catholic Church, which, for example, in its mission to preserve the innocence of rural minds, ensured that certain objectionable films were only shown in cities. That happened at the formation of the state. The assumption that the countryside offered a pastoral antidote to the stresses of the urban marketplace is again consistent with Western European primitivist ideas, which paid little attention to the realities and difficulties of rural life at the time.
So Paul Henry's romantic painting in Connemara, this one here, from 1925 was used by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway Company to promote rail holidays in Ireland, and the present day remains fixed in the collective consciousness as an iconic and authentic vision of the west of Ireland. Henry intentionally constructed these bucolic scenes, and he chastised, gave out to the Achill Island women who arrived to model for him, wearing modern stockings and high heels instead of like barefoot and wearing their grandmother's shawls. Poor old lady here. This kind of romanticised, depopulated and primitive representation of Ireland was subsequently adopted by the modern state's own tourist industry, sitting uneasily alongside our colonial past. And as Stephanie Rains writes, the depiction of Ireland as a pre-modern ideal for visitors, and by implication for the Irish too, is one of the most consistently recurring themes of the nation's tourist imagery. This process has its roots within colonial imaginings of Ireland, in which the land and its people were co-opted into the romantic vision of unspoiled landscapes and equally unspoiled inhabitants, whose culture had not been fractured by the civilization of modernity. Thus, Ireland for the imperial visitor represented the possibility of cultural renewal, even while his positioning of the Irish and their land also provided justification for the continuation of the imperial project. End quote.
It's heavy stuff. So here's a JFK tea towel. Ireland and the United States have each adopted the myth of the Western frontier as a national ideal. American pop cultural narratives often simplify the struggles faced by Irish people and other emigrants at the turn of the century in order to create their own foundational myth. Epic land rush capers, such as the 1992 flop Far and Away, which you saw Tom Cruise in earlier in the slideshow, show displaced yet spirited emigrants braving the Atlantic to gain prosperity with nothing but hard work and perseverance. President John F. Kennedy celebrated here in immigrant communities as the first US president of Irish Catholic heritage, wrote in his 1958 book, A Nation of Immigrants, that another way of indicating the importance of immigration to America is to point out that every American who ever lived, with the exception of one group, was either an immigrant himself or a descendant of immigrants. Everywhere immigrants have enriched and strengthened the fabric of American life. So, as an aside, this commemorative detail is held in the Galway Museum collections. It's striking to note that America's origin myth as a nation of immigrants stands in direct contradiction to the current administration's policy of mass deportations, the cornerstone of the current president's political campaigning. Although it's important to note that JFK also wrote, "Today, when mass communications tell one part of the world all about another, it is relatively easy to understand how poverty or tyranny might compel people to exchange an old nation for a new one, but centuries ago migration was a leap into the unknown." So I think this reveals a type of sympathy that considers one type of immigration as distinct from another. Modern immigration is somehow opportunistic, while historical migration was a leap of faith.
This fantasy of the so-called American dream has endured in the country's origin story, relying on a European immigrant perspective that would become the basis for white nationalism in America, an ideology enthusiastically embraced by many Irish immigrants. Earlier Westerns portrayed a highly aestheticized version of the frontier, as exemplified in the Technicolor movies of John Ford, while back in Ireland, the genre's archetypes were reflected in modern paintings such as Men of the West by Sean Keating. In both versions, the West represents an imagined frontier zone tinged with hardship and opportunity, a place somehow as yet uncorrupted by the creeping progress of modernization. Familiar tropes from cowboy films overlap with the nationalist imagery described above, such as the sinful city, expanding skies or expansive skies, and the so-called empty frontier, as well as stock characters, including the wanderer on the road or the resilient townsfolk. Contemporary tourist campaigns for Ireland still rely heavily on images of wild countryside and ancient monuments. However, there is a troubling inconsistency between the promotion of our landscape, culture and heritage by official tourism campaigns, while the Irish state simultaneously acts against those interests. Examples of this include granting mining licenses in environmentally sensitive areas, constructing roads through our national monument sites, or prioritising visitor numbers over conservation measures, to name a few.
Contradictions in our state abound. We claim neutrality, yet permit US warplanes to refuel at Shannon Airport. We call ourselves Ireland of the Welcomes, yet hold asylum seekers in draconian for-profit direct provision centres. We promote Ireland's natural beauty while failing to implement biodiversity protection policies. Why is this, another question, why is this hypocrisy so deeply embedded in our national consciousness, imagining on the one hand a magical unspoiled land of wild beauty, and creating on the other a corporate tax haven whose ecosystem has suffered a transformation of identity and a loss of defining features? There's long been a cognitive dissonance in the way Ireland conceives its own identity, which Joop Laerssen suggests can be seen as a measure of the discontinuity and fragmentation of Irish historical development, itself caused by its oppression at the hands of the neighbouring Isle.
The most tragic manifestations of this contradictory position as both abused and abuser was the role played by Irish people in the institution of slavery. Although they were victims of British oppression themselves, the Irish generally failed to make common cause with other oppressed people in the so-called New World. For example, the export of preserved meat and dairy to colonies in the West Indies in the 18th century enriched merchants in Munster, while others captained slave ships or worked as overseers or on plantations in antebellum America. Some Irish immigrants became owners of enslaved people or enthusiastic public defenders of slavery, such as writer John Mitchell. Although there were Irish anti-slavery societies and abolitionists, most famously Daniel O'Connell. Many opportunities for solidarity were missed. When British MP William Wilberforce attempted to introduce an abolition bill into the House of Commons in 1805, Irish MPs failed to vote for it, preferring to appear to support the government and therefore acquire positions of power in Dublin. Or when Charles Lennox Remond brought to the US a letter signed by Daniel O'Connell in 1842, asking Irish Americans to take the lead in the anti-slavery cause, it was publicly rejected by the Irish Catholic community, who did not want to be associated with abolitionist criticisms of the Constitution and institutions of their new home.
Oh, instead of recognising a shared struggle against racism and class oppression, many Irish people identified instead with a newfound sense of whiteness in America, and therefore an opportunity to accrue their own power and wealth. We see ourselves as being at a crucial juncture, particularly what's happening in the States at the moment. We're acknowledging our own complicity and facilitating these global processes historically and in contemporary society would be the first step towards disrupting them, and not just for our own personal good. As Donald Atkinson writes, in the self-replicating cycle of abuser, abused, abuser, abused is to be broken, if it's to be broken, the Irish polity, through the historians who are the keepers of its collective memory, must cease to view the emigrants from Ireland as forever passive victims, and therefore as persons who are incapable of hard dealing.
Through a collection of disarticulated bones, which is like the overarching name we have for this research project we're on, we are attempting to acknowledge our past struggles, confront our complicities, and crucially build our capacity for solidarity. So we'll finish with a very different kind of Imrica collection letter. This is by someone called William Ritchie, who was a former servant based in Allegheny in Pennsylvania, to a Mrs. J. Heron, County Down, on the 1st of January 1865. He says, "I saw the desolation of war that African slavery has brought upon this land, but slavery is now dead, and it will be forever buried with the end of this rebellion. Slavery was the curse, and it is right it should die." So that's a load of information there for you now, but we're going to shift gear and just talk more practically about our research methods and sources, and we'll talk through some works and show a couple of video clips.
Great, cool.
Yeah, we could pause for questions before we
Oh,
get more information. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I wonder, is this the context of your project, your research? If that's so, what is your question? Because I often ask by my supervisor, what is your research question? So I'm just wondering, what is the main focus?
Why are we such hypocrites as a nation?
That's
my question.
Identity,
Yeah.
and it's related to America, also related to British, and maybe because I come from Asia, it's a bit far away from me, the history. So I'm really curious what kind of specific question you want to ask about Irish identity. Is you're talking about our day identity or what? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're looking at identity, like specifically Western or so-called Western identities in the global North, as being a construction and being made out of a set of narratives, a set of stories. So we're always thinking about how storytelling, whether it's through like state records, tourist information, pop culture, or folk stories, how that all contributes to a sense of Irishness that's essentially constructed, and what stories we often leave out of the overarching narratives.
Why they were constructed and who's profiting from them, and how we can try and find common cause with people and have solidarity, global solidarity out of that.
It's kind of try to find a global Irish identity nowadays, like that.
That's a huge task. I think we could show film that answers the question, maybe the bricks.
Yeah.
So I suppose what we do is this research project became a small exhibition that was part of the Tulka Visual Arts Festival last autumn, and we had four videos and some objects shown in Galway City Museum. So we were able to bring some stories from storytellers that were filmed in like just a very straight up documentary style. Well, you'll see. I don't know if it's that straight up. Into the museum collection. So kind of disrupting the overarching narratives that are in there by bringing in different stories and letting them sit next to this historical collection, letting them sit next to objects that have been collected and have been given that sort of power. So some of them are stories that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find in a museum. So let's show that film because I think that...
Before explaining the background?
Yeah.
Okay.
Probably it was around about 20 years ago, and the museum was, the Ulster Folk Park was looking at ways that it was better tell the story of Irish migration to America, particularly along the Appalachians. I was looking for more rural houses to tell the story, and they were looking also to expand the geographic area that we looked at, because early on most of our houses had come from Pennsylvania. So there was another house coming from West Virginia, and then this house was found in northern Tennessee. The house fitted what the museum wanted to do because there was a direct Irish migrant story involved. The Irish migrant was quite well known in the area. He was a guy called Hugh Rogan, and the house that presented to the museum back at that point in time was only part of the original house. It was actually an extension to the original house, but the original house had been taken to a museum at Fort Bledsoe, just a few miles outside of Nashville. So the museum was more than happy to have what was the second generation extension, and funding was secured. It was taken down brick by brick by an American company, packed into containers and then brought over to Ireland and then reassembled here by an Irish company. It was the first house that was brought to the museum that wasn't a log structure. It was in fact all brick, but the bricks were all numbered, and we decided to put the bricks back up in the sequence that they had come down in, so it was a perfect reconstruction of the original house. The Rogan family came from the parish of Erney, which is very close to where the folk park is situated, probably only about 15 miles down the road. The first emigrant to America was Hugh Rogan. He actually married a local girl called Anne or Nancy Duffy, and they had a child, Bernard. Now, Hugh must have been reasonably well off because he decided to go to America to see if America would be suitable to emigrate to. So he left Nancy and his son with the idea of coming back within a year. He took some cloth for sale and went to America with his cousin. Now, the year they landed in America was 1775. Next year was the American War of Independence, so it was impossible for Hugh to get back home. Hugh took part in the American War of Independence. Towards the latter part of that war, he was also involved in making maps in northern Tennessee, and then after the war was over, he returned to northern Tennessee with a party of settlers. Think about making maps. That's the first element of colonisation. You can't colonise until you make a map. And then once you make the map, then the settlers come. And then he was part of that settlement process that pushed the native people off the ground, settled the ground, and then with the desire to make money, the area that he settled in was capable of producing cotton, and cotton being a plantation crop, the most profitable way to produce cotton was to make use of slave labour. So you push the Native American people off, you take their land, and then you force African Americans through slavery to then work on the land to produce your wealth for you, and that's in a nutshell what Hugh's story was. Now, Hugh had intended to go back home to pick up his wife and his son, but he was told that his wife had now thought Hugh to be dead and that she'd actually been married in Ireland. And in order to not cause a scandal, Hugh decided not to go back to Ireland. So he remained in America. Because he was one of the early settlers in northern Tennessee, he acquired quite a large proportion of land. Again, being an early settler and having a lot of military experience, he was involved in quite a number of encounters and skirmishes with indigenous people in the area, and he was known pejoratively as an Indian fighter. So we can see that he was a man that was prepared to use force of arms to take the land that he was on. So he ended up with a couple of 100 acres outside of Gallatin, not far from Nashville. And then, about 18 years later, after leaving Ireland for the first time, he has heard now from people who've come back, who've come from Ireland, who knew his wife. He finds out that she actually never married and that she's still waiting for him. So within a year, he went back to Ireland, found his wife and his son, and brought them back to America. During the time of deconstruction of the house, the dismantlers found a few unusual bricks, and they left them to one side so that they weren't put back into the house again. Two of these bricks of the greatest interest, one had a small child's footprint on it, and the other had a small child's handprint. The assumption was that this would have been an enslaved child who would have been running around the brickyard. The brickyard used for making the bricks would have been, we haven't identified exactly where it was, but would have been reasonably close to where the Rogan house was actually built. So at the time, these bricks were just used in the house structure, but we didn't put them back into the house structure. We kept them to one side.
So we put that video in the Galway Museum, but we've also the bricks that's Liam Corrie, the curator of emigration at the Ulster American Folk Park, which is part of the Northern Irish Museums in Northern Ireland.
Ulster Museum?
I think it's part of the Ulster Museum. He's speaking about these bricks that were removed from this house that was brought brick by brick from Tennessee to Northern Ireland in the early 2000s. And we've also shown those bricks through collaboration with them in a museum show in Sligo, which showed some of the Paul Henry paintings that you saw, some Sean Keating paintings, and other kind of nationalistic paintings from the turn of the century. A lot of them depicting, parochial houses and farmhouses, but these were on their own. So to just insert that narrative into broader sort of imagery that you imagine to belong to part of our history, was just kind of pointing at a different kind of a story or a different kind of a reality that also belongs to us and belongs to people of Irish Catholic background. So I don't know if sometimes the work answers a question a little bit better because the medium is film, so that's the language. Does that answer your question?
I think so. So I'm more clear now. It's more talking about immigrant identity.
Both, I think. Like how
I know because this part of history you cannot raise from Irish people, right? So this is kind of one kind of storytelling, alternative view from museum to like enrich this kind of Irish identity, I guess, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that particular piece, I guess, is about that point of departure. And Hugh Rogan, who built the original house in Tennessee, would have been seen as a defender of the land in Ireland. He would have been seen as someone who defended Irish Catholic homes against basically mobs who were enforcing the penal laws in Ireland. So he went and kind of aligned himself with British settlers who were doing the same thing in America to Indigenous people. So it's just another story. It's not to say that people didn't have a hard time, they did, but it's to say that, yeah, they were not incapable of hard doings. So we go back to, is there any more questions on that? Yeah.
It's not a question. I don't know if I told you the story before, but just looking at that, and I know I know this story already, but I read this book called Spectacle of Property. It's about the house in cinema, in Hollywood cinema in particular. But there's this amazing story that starts with it. So do you know the film To Kill a Mockingbird?
Yes.
So To Kill a Mockingbird is supposed this great anti-racist story, right? But the village where it's set in the film, they made so when they were looking to build the set for the village, they used this Picano village town that had been cleared to build the LA freeway. So when they built the LA freeways, they just went through immigrant communities and they just bulldozed them like they did in New York and all this. So it's about that kind of what's invisible and what's visible and making the invisible visible. And so the point is like, this what you see, the visible thing is this anti-racist story, but actually racism is built into the structure of the film. It's literally appropriating this community's property that was just bulldozed, and then they reused it to make this. So I just find that that idea of like what you've done there of making, going back like the bricks, the visibility that's hidden literally in the walls of the house of this kind of this other Irish narrative of enslavement, etc., is just so fascinating. I think it's amazing to bring that out. That's all.
Thank you. Because the folk park, when you visit it, it's a place where people will go on school trips and you bring kids there, and it can feel like a real celebration of the plucky Irish figure going and making a fortune. It has the original, so the foundation house, which is the one house that was actually on the land where the folk park is now, is what would have been the Mellon family house before they emigrated to Pittsburgh. So a lot of Mellon Foundation money goes into the park, and their stories are really held up as these big success stories, whereas the underlying truth, the Mellons themselves weren't specifically enslavers, but they did suppress workers' movements, they were war profiteers, they played both sides of the Civil War through arming and through the steel industry. So none of those stories are there. It's they got educated, they became bankers, and voila, like they earned a fortune, and so this one house, it's really great to hear Liam talk about it because it tells a totally different story, and it is there in the park. It's just not the most prominent house or the most prominent story, though the house, when you go into it, does have a real atmosphere, because it's totally different. Even the brick structure of it would have been really imperial in that part of America at the time. It's totally rural, and you would have to hand bake and hand cast every single brick, like 30,000 bricks. So it was something that you would do as a status symbol, and you had to have a lot of labour, a lot of slave labour to create a house like that. You had a question.
Yeah, it's all really great. I just want to, have you had a chance yet to show this to Irish American audiences, or when you were over there, did you present it to them?
We did, and we were apprehensive about it. They were unbelievable. They were so into it. Okay. But I suppose as the person it was Solas Nua, as the Irish arts organisation in Washington, the guys who work there pointed out they're very self-selecting crowd who like visual art and like Ireland or whatever. So we were worried that they might find it personally offensive, but they really were on for it.
I guess this narrative, not this narrative, the other narrative, is so much in our own identity, and especially in the Irish American identity. And I'm sure a lot of us have family in the States, or I have family in the States. I've been over there, and you get the he's from the old country, and so any kind of break from that would be like but again, selective audience, I guess, as well.
Exactly, in an urban setting as well. But then probably so many Irish Americans have had to confront these questions far sooner than we thought about them, probably, because it's so immediate over there.
Yeah.
Depends on where you live, I imagine.
Yeah, we showed them in Virginia as well, and I don't think people they didn't have open criticism for those narratives, but I think people are a little bit more comfortable. And what we realised and what was really valuable going over there was a lot of that's our own stuff. You know, that we're like the Republican narrative is so strong here, and we see ourselves as rebels and victims, and we overcame, and that stuff is true. But we can look into the past for potentials where there were moments where we could have had solidarity, or we could have had a different kind of society than we have today, and that's sort of what the work's trying to out, I suppose. But yeah, we were quite impressed. We were really impressed actually with audiences in the States, because I think they're a little bit more comfortable talking darker histories.
JFK detail, my grandmother had a letter from JFK or from the White House after his visit. I went into the house and it was the letter right next to a picture of the Pope, and that was it.
Yeah. 2 visits, 2 people who ever yeah. The kind of, I guess one thing we're interested in going to Washington is those places that are like touched by celebrity. There's so many places in Ireland that are an American president's homestead, no matter how no matter how long the link is or how tenuous the connection. And I don't know if any other country has that, even though there's been American presidents of all sorts of lineage. It's like we really claim it in a really sort of, I guess, opportunistic way, I think.
It's also interesting talking to the younger people over there and how little they think about Ireland.
Yes.
You know, like we have it in our with this like sense of self-importance or something on the global stage, but actually like it's the Irish American influence is declining, and even the stereotypes, because we asked a class of college students like, what do you think about when you think about Ireland, expecting them to be like leprechauns, drunk people or whatever, but even those stereotypes have kind of dissipated. They were just like, it's kind of, what's the word?
They were like, I don't mean to be rude, but grey.
Grey, drab.
Yeah. Strangely, the Paul Henry image is still the image. So it's not that sort of party culture image that people still have. They have a grey sky, stone walls, loads of people said, because they're so unusual in the rest of the world. Or like those stone fences you have. And I thought that was really interesting, because we're always kind of thinking about that Paul Henry image as the archetypal image of the west of Ireland, and it's still there among people in their teens and 20s who've never been to Ireland, don't intend on going to Ireland.
I'm watching Mad Men at the moment, and there's an episode where they're engaged with a company called McCann. I didn't even twig it. The amount, so every stereotype about the Irish, like we're drunk, we're thick, the whole lot. I was even just like, holy shit, they're really known for it. But anyway.
I was walking down the street in Seattle a few years ago, and there was a guy in front of me, a Latino man in his 20s wearing a hoodie, said, I'm not loud, I'm just Irish. I was just trying to understand, I was like, that's the most complex thing I've ever seen. I don't understand, I don't understand this. I wanted to talk and ask him to explain. I'd love to I think he could write a PhD on that hoodie. What are the underlying ideas in that hoodie?
Oh, we can get away with it,
Yeah, I'm not loud.
We're allowed.
Yeah. So is it a positive? Is it good?
I'm not engaging in systems of oppression. I'm an Irish cop. It's cool. I think, I'd like to write that thesis. We have more on sort of research methodology stuff, if you want to get into that.
We love research methodology.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's really, we're just going to make a series of very obvious statements. And it will not be news to any of you, but it's just, we thought it'd be worthwhile pointing out some of our sources, because we spend so much of our time researching. So we're just going to breeze through what we actually use to do the research.
Yeah, where it all comes from.
Yeah. Okay. So First of all, the Irish News Archive, which requires a subscription but is great for local news, and we'll mention an example of where that came in.
It's only €30 for a month, so if you have a specific topic or story, like from a local community, say, so what we're going to get into is a UFO that was seen in a little town in West Limerick. So you can search, it's all of the local papers plus the Independent. The Irish Times is a separate one. You can find, like, you can just do a week's research and find everything that was recorded on this specific story. So like it could be a story here in the poem, and you're like, let's see if that really happened or if that was reported on. And I just find it really useful to just grab a month's subscription and do a ton of research. You know.
This Drive folder full of PDFs from the Irish News Archive, so
Yeah.
that's brilliant. Internet Archive, I'm sure everyone knows, but it just feels increasingly important. And it's great, obviously, for not out of copyright books and sound recordings and moving image and the whole shebang. So,
Government websites that have been taken down.
Sorry, just to say, the library has a subscription to Irish News Archive.
Hey,
there you go.
So you can do it for free.
amazing. Yeah, totally worth it.
The Field Manuscripts is the Dúchas collection. So, you know, it was Irish Folklore Commission in the 1930s. I suppose they realised that there's a chance all these things could be lost. So they sent all the school children of the country out to collect stories from their older neighbours and relatives. And there's thousands and thousands of scans of beautiful copybooks where they've written down like local stories and cures and curses and everything. So you could go as local as like a townland if you really want to find out the history of an area. It's a great way to do that. Library of Congress, very famous, but again has tons of scans of newspapers, maps, and recordings. There's amazing old archival field recordings of people talking and singing, which, you know, you don't need a subscription for either of these. You can go on. Big obvious ones.
Yeah.
But I think it's nice to mention because, you know, we spend so much of our time online. It's a real treat to go to the National Library in Dublin and you can get a reader's card and you don't need to be an academic or whatever. Anyone can get a reader's card and you can go in and sit in this beautiful room and look at these incredible books in person, which I don't think there's any substitute for that.
There's also, they have hard copy newspaper archives. So if you find something in the newspaper archive and it's they've basically scanned the microfilm, the images are totally corrupted. But if you say like, I really like to reproduce this image, you can go to the National Library and actually get a copy of the paper. It's
great. National Archives, obviously, all the government records, state papers, countless artifacts, something like 60 million different documents that they have. The military archives are also good for the pension files. So if you're researching revolutionary history, you can look into that. That's all online as well.
Military Archives has brilliant maps as well. So they're separate from the Ordnance Survey map. And you can get maps of really specific areas in Ireland, especially around the turn of the century. And they're really open if people want to come in and use their research sources. They'll bring things out for you, so they're really generous.
I think it's good to know because sometimes you might think you have to be like a college professor or something to get into these places, but you can be anybody.
Yeah. Unaffiliated.
Yeah.
Like ourselves.
Obviously, college, university library is very obvious, but this one on the left here is it's a picture from the Guillermo Harry's archive that we were talking about earlier. It's a letter. So we were able to see, again, they very kindly brought out the collection for us. And for some reason, they were all miniature. It's only about the size. But even seeing that is just thrilling, I think, seeing these things in person. And then on the other side, so that's an example of a project that we made that came out of getting to use materials from the Trinity Manuscripts collection. They were this magic lantern slides belonging to Richard Hingston, who was an explorer, naturalist, doctor, who got to go on the first, the ill-fated Mallory Irving Everest attempt in 1924, I think it was. So we got permission to publish those slides for the first time, and they're in this book. The text to go with it. So that is an example of how this research can manifest in the work as well. So we talked through. We just wanted to talk through the process. I just thought, I don't know, it might be helpful because I think art can be mysterious. People can make it mysterious, but maybe to talk through exactly how we made a piece And if it's too boring, you can tell us.
Well, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, this piece. So yeah, we can often, like, we can talk forever about what the themes are of the work, but it's, I think, important to show you where it actually gets pointed at. So this piece was exhibited alongside the video you saw earlier, Brick by Brick. This one was made in a small town called Askeaton, where we do a lot of work with the organisation Askeaton Contemporary Arts. So they run an international artist residency every summer, and we did that in 2018, and we've been coming back ever since. So around 2018, when we were there, it's a 2-week artist residency, and you're trying to make work really, really quickly and also socialise, and it's very intense, but very enriching process. But we found this newspaper article about a pair of guards who were on night patrol in 1994, I want to say, or 1993, and they saw a UFO in the sky, and it was reported on in papers all over the west of Ireland, but we have an archive of UFO sightings throughout history in Ireland, and this one was reported on very differently because it was 2 guards, 2 cops who saw it, and so it was given a really different treatment, because first of all, it's 2 people seeing it, so I have a witness to my witnessing, and second of all, they're upstanding members of society, they're, you know, commanding respect. So they called it into Shannon Airport, Shannon said there was nothing on in the skies that night, and so they took it to be a UFO. Also, it was around the time of UFO fever, so everyone's watching the X-Files, everyone's seeing stuff in the sky, but at the same time there's military testing happening at Shannon Airport, and the types of things in the Irish sky on the west coast that no one's ever seen before. So what they saw was a craft, sort of this shape that just hovered silently above the town. They thought it was going to crash. It was a really scary thing to see, and it didn't have any sound. So this, yeah. So then, do you want to say how we found Michael?
Yeah, well, I think what's important about the process so far is, first of all, being in the place and being there with a local guide. So Michelle, who runs the residency, was like our point of contact. So we not only have her kind of mediating the place, we are also physically there and able to walk around, look at the landscape, meet the people, try and learn about it, and also while simultaneously reading through the archives, the newspaper archives. And then because Michelle was our point of contact and she has the trust of local people and the knowledge, we were able to show her the article. She recognised names and was then able to chase up the lead of the guard and find out where he was, what he was doing. And so it didn't come out of the blue then, us just contacting this man. It came through her, and she's very sensitive with working with people, so it was to ensure that it was a balanced relationship, that we didn't feel like we were taking advantage of this man or laughing at his story or anything. It was really important.
Yeah. So she set up a meeting with us, and this is one of the guards, Michael O'Flaherty, who is since retired, and he runs a luxury wedding car hire service. So he has 2 Bentleys and I can't remember what else, but once we met him and learned about his story, we asked would he drive us to the spot where he saw the UFO and tell us the story. And it's also in the Brick video earlier. We're trying to show stories that you don't normally get to hear, but also in a non-hierarchical way. So any sort of digressions that he has or other interesting parts of his story that he tells us, we just kept in, or we edited them in a kind of non-linear way. So it's not just like I went here and I did this and I did this. It's the way really people tell stories to each other. You know, if you just met them in the street.
Yeah, exactly. Wind here.
The whole thing.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then, so in order to make it, we organised with Michael so we set a date and we organised how much we were going to pay him, you know, to drive us around, and he was happy to be filmed, and we rented equipment. There's this excellent resource in the Northwest called Creative Heartlands, which you can rent good film equipment and it's all your recording equipment from. So we wanted to up our production value as much as we are able to. So we rented that, planned how we would shoot it, and because there's 2 of us, it works well. Niamh was sitting in the front and could kind of chat to Michael and draw out the story, and I was sitting in the back, like trying to be very still. But there's no seatbelts in a Bentley, so I was kind of bouncing around the place. And like we favour this DIY approach. I suppose we've never hired a crew or anything like that. We always do it ourselves, which has benefits and drawbacks. I'd say the benefits is that you can be very light on your feet and kind of spontaneous and cost effective, obviously. The drawbacks are maybe it's quite wobbly footage.
I suppose. But the other thing is the more people you have in a crew, when you're doing that kind of an intimate interview, the further the distance is from you and your subject. So another, like, we were also able to be really clear with Michael how it was going to feel in the car. Important thing with interviewing is saying, you know, I'm going to chat to you now, but when I'm interviewing you, I'm probably not going to respond to what you're telling me, just so that we have a really nice, clear recording. So someone's set up for that, then they're much calmer when they're telling the story. It doesn't feel awkward in the same way. And then also to let those digressions happen, because sometimes someone has something really magic that you didn't expect.
And then finally we put subtitles on it just for accessibility, and we found a font that is hyper legible, and we made them nice and big, so hopefully well accessible. Maybe we'll watch it.
As we drove along here, we decided we just pulled in here and parked. Any good stories? I'd say it has a lot. But I'm 21 years doing weddings. I bought it 22 years ago, and just doing weddings ever since. That time I was here in Askeaton, and I was on the mobile patrol, now district. We covered a big area. But I'll say that night I'll show you when I'm coming back. We'll drive past exactly where we were driving past, and just happened to see the lights in the sky. And the fact Shannon is just 3 miles across the water as the crow flies. We thought it was maybe something coming out of Shannon, but the lights were very bright, 2 very bright lights. We stepped out, and as we stepped out, both of us looked up, no sound whatsoever, and it was like lights on the end of a wing of a wide aircraft with no sound, and then there seemed to be a little trail behind it of what we thought was like smoke, left the effect of a jet behind it, but it went in a southeasterly direction. And I noted at the time it was 1:13 a.m. exactly, and then half an hour later I just telephoned air traffic control and told them about the sighting and asked them had anything on it. They said there was nothing on radar, but they had sightings from other parts of the country just before I got onto them. Watched it exactly, I'd noted at the time, about 45 seconds roughly, looking at it, moving across until it went out of sight. I collected them in a cottage. They usually groups that come over, they'll stay in cottages around that area. And I collected the bride in a cottage. And the way it was arranged was the groom was collected by the photographer, brought to a location out by the burn overlooking the ocean, and what did they call it? His first look is big, as you know, at American weddings. So the photographer had him at the location, and he had him blindfolded, and then I arrived, the bride, and she just walked up, stood in front of him and took off his blindfold. And then we took photographs around the area for about 45 minutes. It's a thing I like watching is looking into the sky, because we're so near the airport where I am, just back further. We've been the flight path, and during COVID and all that there, this big American, it wasn't an American, this carrier that brought in it was bombed, it was the biggest cargo plane in the world. It came in there during COVID, and it was, as you know, it was bombed in Ukraine, so it doesn't exist anymore. But I went to see that now, flying in and out, because I like watching the sky there day and night. I have the flight radar on my phone, and usually click into it, what's moving overhead, But of course, the odd one that won't be, it's not available. Well, you'd understand that too. Yeah, we said, and then you see Shannon being just across from us and being so close to the airport. It's the first thing you think of. They have to have this on radar. Yeah, well, the first thing that came to our mind was that came out of Shannon. It was so low, but no, that was what we did straight away, and it didn't. But it was encouraging to hear they had other sightings. We'll never know what it was, but just so clear now in my mind, it's something had to be there. That's the way I look at it. And like, for the time, 45 seconds I noted at the time, which is a long time when you're looking at something moving across the skies. It's 45 seconds is, if there's something, a flash, you see just a bit different, but see this just going out of sight. We were expecting, as it went away, we thought it was coming lower, that you'd hear a sound, a crash landing, but no, nothing. Disappeared into the horizon. And they're telling stories about going to Knock once a year. And there was a neighbour of mine who went to Knock, and which drove, and it took most of the day to drive with the car at the time. And he told me he got 6 punctures on the way in the car. And what they do that time was he'd repair it on the side of the road. But that's the way that is. He was telling me, like, to start in the early morning and to be all day on the road, back late at night. But it lets you see the faith they had, the belief, that that's what they were prepared to do. All the ways just to go to Knock. Yeah, and then it was like the moving statues in the 70s or 80s, what that created at the time, and it just wore off again. There was Ballinspittle was the one place I remember in Cork. I'll never forget it now. I never went to see it, but the belief was there. We all kind of believed. It was such an attraction, and people travelled so far to see these moving statues. So it is different things from different times. They spend hours, then waiting just for something to happen. It's amazing what people are interested in, if they're into a certain subject or whatever, and if there's any history, that they'll find it. It's just like you probably just see in just the news there this evening, this bird that has appeared in Mayo, some village in Mayo. He was like a heron, similar to a heron, and he was blown across the Atlantic. They say it was a storm that brought him to Ireland, and he's above on a river in Mayo, and it's beside a small little village, and there's people coming from all over Europe to see him. It's only the second sighting ever in Europe of this particular bird. The other sighting was a few years back in Portugal, and they show him resting on a tree, and they said had to be a storm that brought him across, and they're not good. He's a wild bird, but he's very settled, and they won't repatriate him again back to his own, because they said he's happy where he is, and then just leave him there. He's living off some fish in the river. But there's a lovely story to see this evening on the TV. but you have this strange feeling, you know, what is it? Where's it off to? Will it crash to the ground? You know, you get this feeling within you that this isn't normal. You know, something strange about this. And we both looking at one another and saying, is it going to land? And then as it went out of sight, we waited. Just said, we thought with the way it's going away from us, that was coming lower and lower, but that was obviously just going out of sight and no sound, nothing. You'd have that feeling within you if there's somebody there that feels they're being watched. You don't know what's going to happen. Like it's a strange feeling. You just don't know, and it looked so big. Like it looked to be huge, whatever object, whatever it was. Yeah, what we understood looking at it, that the two bright lights were a wingspan. You know, that's the impression we got. You'll meet, the very odd person that are interested in space, as you know, that, and I'd like to hear these things, because as I said, there's so few that have seen them, you know, and as I said, genuinely seen it because of two of us being there together looking at it. So there is no doubt it was there. But and this is where we were at the time that we just got out here and stood out, and it came from, as I say, Shannon is just this side of us, and we stepped out and watched it move across, and waiting in the silence just to see would we hear any sound. Nothing. So this is where it all happened.
Watch it again. Probably no.
Oh no, we've done that.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah, of course.
Because when you told the story, like my mind went to the moving statues, and I'm just wondering, did that come out organically in the conversation?
I think it did. I think he just popped himself around all these different versions of sightings, like the heron, the statues, the bride, without prompt. You were asking him questions, but you definitely, I think you were like, and what about religious experiences in Ireland?
I did ask about knock.
About knock, but yeah.
Specifically.
Okay, right.
But
Brides and the heron anyway was unprompted.
yeah, it was more just his general experience being a driver and being a storyteller because of that. You know, so many of the couples that he drives to these like beautiful locations are American families, or so the couple he's describing there didn't have any connection to Ireland other than they like coming here. So he's always sort of acting as a storyteller. He's a really good storyteller. But yeah, we gave really broad prompts around, I suppose, his experiences. And I think the knock story came out of maybe a question about the car. And like because the type of car it is, it's from early 1960s, so it's not built for the roads that we have today. So in some of the footage you can see that everyone's creeping behind us because it's so slow. But also like people clap when they see it, people get really excited when it comes by because it's huge. And then we didn't really want to center this sort of like big aristocratic car like it would have been everyone knows the lineage of those cars. So it was originally a Birmingham jam factory owner. It has like little behind the seats for like signing documents and things, like a little drop down. But yeah, we didn't want to center the car so much, but we were interested in stories that happen inside a car, I suppose, because that was going to be the framing. Any other?
What's their reaction when the gentleman saw the was they astonished or excited or?
To say he's very authoritative,
very calm.
I think he's like, he just took it as part of the job, and he wrote a police report and rang Shannon and just kind of followed these steps. He still has the report somewhere.
It's very pragmatic in his description. It's just like say on the job.
Yeah, when you're on night patrol, or when you're on patrol in general, you have to write up a report of your evening's work. So when they're looking at this thing, they're not thinking the way we might think. I mean, when we might just pull out our phones and start recording, but yeah, he's thinking, how am I going to explain this? So he's like, how long was it in the sky? What direction was it moving in? What did it look like? What are the features I can describe? What did it sound like? So like already sort of a story like is starting to emerge, but it's also so practical. And then I think he's able to remember it because he had to write it down in that way. And he went back and looked at what he wrote down, so it's a different kind of memory where he's looking at these newspaper reports that we sent him and then looking at his own reporting, so he's not relying solely on his memory of it, and with the event, which can kind of change, as you know, over time. But yeah, I think they were scared that it would crash at first, but I think now he sees it as just a more sort of medical, physical experience. Yeah, and then he talks a little bit there about meeting other people who've had similar experiences, because it's kind of a rare thing to get to talk about it. Anybody else? About anything?
Sorry, just again, one of the things that struck, the way he was talking about that there, and I'm thinking back because I was a kid in the 80s. I remember the moving statues, and I remember the way they were reported. It was a part of everyday life. You know, it was, you know, and today in the news, some kids have seen a moving statue, and you know, it was, you know, going back to the thing about like the stories that we tell and it was like part of official Ireland. It was, you know, in a way that it's impossible to kind of convey now, but you know, so it was just another thing that happened in Ireland, and in the same way that he's talking about that. That's what I was thinking as I was watching it. It really conveyed that.
Aaron's story is great as well.
Yeah.
I was thinking of like in the context of UFOs, like Alf and all these 1980s aliens, like Alien Life Form or Mork and Mindy, you know, that they come and crash with it.
Yeah, totally. Accepted by the locals.
It was at the same time than in America, because I think it was in the 70s or 80s that a lot of money went to tell these stories in media, and according to some journalists and historians, that like Adam Curtis, that it was just a way of moving people's attention towards something else. But following your research on Irish identity and whatever it is, it's a very interesting example, because as a foreigner, somebody that was told that in Ireland there are only drunk people, and you know, that's a typical stereotypes, like Spanish people, they think that we are always doing ole ole and things like this, you know. If I had to tell how Irish people are, it's kind of what the man I saw, you know, and this generation, I mean, always telling a story, always looking for community, and but the story. And I don't know if it's this is also your angle, that this identity is found actually in these very daily, normal stories. So why do you go to the detail, to the poetic of this man to explain Irish identity?
But the importance of oral culture,
Yeah.
I suppose. Oral culture is so important to Irish history and identity. Is maybe a bit of an antidote to some other of those narratives we were talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then the way the exhibition is, he's talking against 3 other videos that are saying different things and giving a different perspective. So ideally you'd see them all together and they'd all sort of interplay with each other, these different stories. But you're right, like it's like we'd see our practice as kind of storytelling practice, even though we use film or we might use performance to do it, or we might centre other voices, so that short documentaries are about other people's performed storytelling, and yeah, how much of a everyday that thing that is, but it doesn't necessarily get put into a museum collection always.
It's important to think this kind of non-linear way that manifests in when people are trying to tell a story, ordinary people, not master storytellers, that kind of diverges and branches off, that there's something important about the messiness of that versus like grand linear narratives of like progress, for example, like A leading to B. It's important to hold on to like all the subtleties that you can get from storytelling.
It's also, when I was watching it, we were saying the emphasis on oral storytelling, and it's a video work, but the storyteller, you only see the back of their head, bar for one shot where you can kind of see the side. And I said it's in a like multi-media space where it could just be an audio recording in an exhibition space. It doesn't have to. I'm glad it is, but yeah, it's really interesting.
You're his passenger. Yeah, yeah. That was the idea, I guess. Was you're the passenger and you're being brought to the scene of the story, which yeah is quite innocuous. Cloudy evening. Although there's something that situates it in a time and space, because it was when the local elections were happening. We have the odd local election poster going by, but
Ruining our shop.
thankfully not too much. It'd be better if it was.
You get a real sense of place from it as well.
Yeah, and if you know that area, you know that you're like going into the town and then you're coming out of the town and then you're going into Shannon and then you're coming out of Shannon and then you're going back in. So it's kind of, it's a different experience then for a local to see that film, because it's there's a lot of continuity errors in the geography. Okay.